Her own family sold her to a crippled mafia king, but the real shock? This useless replacement bride could hear lies in color. Everyone thought Pearl was just the backup daughter dumped onto Jericho Crane after her perfect sister ran away. Big mistake, because the man sitting in that wheelchair wasn't the only one hiding scars. He thought he was marrying dead weight, but what entered his house was a human lie detector, a walking plot twist, and the one woman about to blow up every secret in the Crane empire.
Burdensome, unwanted, a monster. Pearl stood rooted to the spot, a living statue. Her mother advanced, the sharp click of stiletto heels on the polished floor marking a grim countdown. Each sound was a step toward the gallows. No one desires you, so you will wed the man who is crippled. In the corner, her father slumped, his face hidden in his hands, fingers knotted in a portrait of silent despair. By the window, her sister bathed in sunlight, a triumphant smirk on her lips, the look of one who had narrowly avoided a firing squad. And Pearl, at 27, felt the cold finality of her destiny. She was to be the bride of Jericho Crane, a name that made all of Las Vegas quake, the undisputed kingpin of Sin City. He was a man who once governed a kingdom from the shadows, now confined to a wheelchair for 14 months after his rivals planted an explosive under his car. He was the very man her sister had been betrothed to, only to be deserted without a second thought the instant he lost the use of his legs. Pearl was now the substitute, a cast-off daughter bartered for a strategic alliance. But her family was ignorant of one thing Pearl held a secret, an ability no one would ever credit. She could perceive the color of sound. Each spoken word, every exhale, every pulse of a heart manifested before her as vibrant ribbons of light. Deceit was as black as pitch. Honesty shimmered with the blue light of jade. Animosity blazed crimson like old, dried blood. And her mother's voice at that moment was an abyssal black, a bottomless chasm, the void of a night without moon or stars. For 27 years, Pearl had known only that darkness. She believed it was the world's only offering for her until she met him, the man forsaken by everyone, the man who sat secluded in a darkened chamber refusing all company. His voice was utterly different, and what she saw within it was destined to alter both their lives forever. Comment "Protect Pearl" if you are on her side already. And remember to subscribe and ring that notification bell, because this is just the start of an incredible journey. 3 days later, Pearl stood before the immense oak doors leading to the penthouse suite of the Crane Casino. The white bridal gown her mother had selected was a tight sheath on her generous frame, its waist seams straining with every deep breath she managed. Constance had intentionally picked a dress 2 sizes too small, a final biting reminder that Pearl was unworthy of anything that truly fit her in this life. Knox Mercer, the head of security for the Crane family, swung the doors inward and gestured for her to enter. His expression was a blank mask, but Pearl saw his terse voice carry a tint of pale gray, impartial, neither hostile nor welcoming. The suite was submerged in shadow. Heavy black velvet drapes were drawn, sealing out the brilliant Las Vegas sun. A scattering of dim lamps cast a weak, yellow luminescence, like candles that had burned to their halfway point. The air was frigid enough to prickle Pearl's skin with goosebumps, and a subtle aroma of aged wood and whiskey hung in the atmosphere. There, in the very center, its back to the entrance, a matte black wheelchair sat as still as a sculpture. The man seated within it did not deign to turn. Eleanor Crane was beside her son, her platinum hair styled in a severe bob, her steely gray eyes dissecting Pearl from head to toe. She remained silent, yet her gaze alone was enough for Pearl to know she was being appraised and valued like an object on display. Jericho remained facing away. He was conversing with a man in a gray suit, likely a lawyer, his voice a low monotone in the quiet chamber. "Can she even write her name? Or should I have a stamp made?" And Pearl perceived the color. It was a murky gray, not the black of malice nor the red of fury, but a dull gray like a thick fog. It was like cigarette smoke fading into nothing, like a spirit gradually sinking into oblivion, too depleted to fight back. Pearl saw that wisp of color hang in the air, and in a flash of insight, she knew this man wasn't cruel, he was decaying from the inside. Before she could halt the impulse, Pearl spoke. "Your voice is a muddy gray, like a person who has trapped himself in a room without windows." The room went still. The lawyer's hands paused over the documents. Eleanor's brow furrowed. Behind her, Knox inhaled sharply. And Jericho Crane, for the first time in 14 months, was stopped dead by the words of another. The wheelchair swiveled with a deliberate slowness. For the first time, Pearl beheld his face. It was sharp and unforgiving, with high cheekbones made gaunt by lost weight. His storm-gray eyes were locked on her, unblinking. A thin scar traced a path from his temple to his left cheek, a fissure across a stone effigy. He must have been breathtakingly handsome once, Pearl mused, the sort of perilous beauty that both beckoned and warned you away. But that appeal had been eroded by suffering into something more tragic. "And who are you?" Jericho inquired, his voice quiet and measured. Pearl met his stare without flinching. "The woman you are about to make your wife, against your will." A heavy silence fell. Eleanor moved to intervene, but Jericho raised a hand, silencing her. He studied Pearl for several more heartbeats, his dark gray gaze intensifying as if searching for something hidden in her expression. Then he angled his chair toward the table, his tone as cold as winter. "Proceed, I don't have all day." The ritual was finished in less than 10 minutes. There was no music, no blossoms, no wedding bands. Eleanor claimed they would be arranged later, though Pearl knew it was a promise never to be kept. The lawyer recited from sterile legal papers. Pearl inscribed her name. Jericho added his without a glance at the page, and it was done. Pearl Whitmore was erased, replaced by Pearl Crane in a dark room, surrounded by people who did not want her. The moment his signature was complete, Jericho spun his wheeled chair and departed without a final word, without a look back. Eleanor followed her son, leaving Pearl to stand alone in the center of the room as the lawyer collected his documents and Knox stood guard by the door. Pearl watched Jericho's silhouette vanish through the doorway, and she saw that muddy gray wisp trailing him, like the fading tail of a dying comet. That night, Pearl was escorted to the Crane estate. The sleek, modern mansion rested on a hill overlooking Las Vegas, a fortress of glass and steel shimmering in the desert. The security here was even more formidable than at the casino. Cameras observed from every angle, while guards patrolled throughout the night. Pearl was shown to the master suite, a space as vast as the entire attic she had formerly inhabited. A king-sized bed was dressed in white silk sheets, a crystal chandelier hung overhead, and a walk-in closet surpassed the size of her previous bedroom, and it was cold, a chill that seeped into her bones despite the heating system running. Jericho was nowhere to be seen. Nina Santos, the estate's housekeeper, a small Filipino woman with kind eyes, was the only one to speak with Pearl that evening. She gently clarified that the master had not emerged from his private quarters since the incident, that Pearl should not take it personally, that things would improve. Nina's voice was a gentle, pale blue, the color of earnest sincerity, devoid of any ulterior motive. Pearl offered her thanks and assured her she was not hurt. It was the honest truth. She had long ago grown accustomed to being forsaken. At midnight, sleep eluded Pearl. The chamber was too immense, too still, too strange. She rose from the bed, donned the thin robe Nina had provided, and began to wander the estate. The corridors seemed to stretch into infinity, lined with expensive art and cold statues. Pearl drifted past the living room, the dining hall, the library, all of them dark and vacant, like a museum after hours. She then found the end of the eastern wing, an old wooden door, more ancient than the rest. Its paint was flaking at the edges. Its brass lock was tarnished with age. It was the only door that appeared as if it had remained unopened for a great deal of time. Pearl placed her ear to the wood, and she detected it. A faint whisper from within, like a breeze, like a sigh, like the sound of a room holding its breath for someone's return. The following night, Pearl came back, armed with a hairpin. She had learned the art of lockpicking from videos online during her years of confinement in the attic. Whenever Constance would lock her in to prevent her from spoiling Jasmine's parties. After a few tense moments, the ancient lock yielded. The door groaned open with a sound like time itself stirring. Pearl slipped inside. The chamber was steeped in darkness and dust. A sliver of moonlight filtered through a sheer curtained window, illuminating the huge form in the center of the room. Pearl drew nearer and pulled back the dust sheet. A black Steinway grand piano was revealed. A heavy blanket of dust coated its lid, yet the instrument's body was flawless, still magnificent, like a slumbering princess in a forgotten wood, awaiting a touch to reawaken her. Pearl reached for the keys. Her fingers shook as the cool ivory met her flesh. She pressed down. A solitary note sang out in the silent chamber, and before Pearl's eyes, color erupted. Gold, luminous and warm as the dawn of a summer's day. For the first time in many, many years, Pearl witnessed that color. For the first time in many years, she played. Her fingers moved on their own, and music spilled forth like a river bursting through a dam. With each note, the world around Pearl dissolved. Time ceased to exist. The gilded cage of a room, the lie of her marriage, all of it melted away into the golden light and the melody she created. She had no idea that the estate's silent network of cameras captured it all. Nor did she know that in a dark room on the West Wing, Jericho Crane sat before a monitor, watching. For 14 months, his face had been a frozen mask, but now a subtle change occurred, a hairline fracture in a wall of ice. Knox entered the room, his eyes shifting from the screen to Jericho. "Shall I have her stop?" A heavy silence filled the space before Jericho finally spoke, his voice a lower octave than usual. "No, let her play." Knox couldn't conceal his shock. For 14 months, nothing had reached his employer. Not his business, his family, not the concepts of life or death. He had simply sat in the darkness, waiting for the end. But tonight, something had broken through the static. Something had made him pause and listen. Jericho stared at the screen, at this stranger who was his wife, and couldn't comprehend why her music made the suffocating darkness in his chest feel just a little lighter. From that night forward, Jericho watched the cameras in secret. Whenever Pearl played, he told no one. He didn't know why. He only knew her melodies made the endless nights more bearable, a relief he hadn't known for the past 14 months. On the 5th day following the wedding, a summons came from Eleanor Crane. Lena Santos arrived at her door that morning, a flicker of worry in the housekeeper's eyes as she relayed that the madam wanted to see her. Pearl simply nodded, asking no questions, showing no fear. After 27 years under Constance Whitmore's thumb, she was accustomed to being called to receive scorn or cold directives. Eleanor Crane was more powerful, more dangerous, but not fundamentally different. Eleanor's study was on the second floor down the western hall. The room was a cavern of dark, heavy wood and deep red velvet that smothered the light. The scent of expensive perfume mingled with the old leather of the armchairs. Behind a black oak desk sat Eleanor, her spine perfectly straight, her steel-gray eyes locked on Pearl the moment she entered. She did not offer a seat. Pearl did not expect one. She stood before the desk, arms loose at her sides, and waited. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming a soft rhythm on the wood. Then she opened a drawer and laid a deadly firearm on the desk. She didn't aim it at Pearl. She merely placed it there, the black steel gleaming coldly under the lamplight. Pearl gazed at the weapon. She didn't flinch, didn't gasp, didn't tremble. She observed it as if it were just another paperweight on the desk. A corner of Eleanor's mouth lifted. "This is a reminder of power. You need not be afraid. You need only understand." Pearl nodded. "I understand." To Pearl, Eleanor's voice was the color of steel gray, not the pitch black of Constance's rage, but the cold, calculating hue of logic without emotion. It was the color of a person who saw others as pawns on a board, to be used and discarded without love or hate. Eleanor was direct. "You are here for a single purpose, to give the Crane family an heir." This was no surprise to Pearl. She had suspected it from the start. Jericho was the sole heir, and after his accident, the family's future was in question. Eleanor needed a grandchild to secure the Crane lineage, to protect the empire she had built. "I will give you 6 months," Eleanor stated, her tone like a clause in a contract. 6 months to conceive, succeed, and you will live in unimaginable luxury." She paused, her gray eyes boring into Pearl's. "But if there is no result after 6 months, then the Whitmore family will face difficulties, a great many of them." Pearl knew precisely what she meant. Her father, for all his weakness, was the only person who had ever shown her true affection. Eleanor was using Gerald as a hostage. It was a common tactic among the powerful, one Pearl had witnessed countless times. Leaning back, Eleanor waited for the inevitable surrender. She had seen far stronger people crumble. No one denied the Cranes. But Pearl did not bow her head. She met Eleanor's gaze and said, her voice impossibly calm, "I cannot do that." Silence. For the first time, Eleanor blinked, a flicker of surprise crossing her features. "What did you say?" "I cannot do what you ask," Pearl repeated. "It is not a matter of will, it is a matter of ability." Eleanor's brow furrowed, her eyes darkening. "Are you refusing me?" Pearl took a breath, marshaling her thoughts. "I have a condition. When I am touched without genuine affection, I hear the sound of shattering glass inside my head. The pain is severe." Eleanor was still, her gaze narrowing, judging the truth of the claim. Pearl went on, "If your son and I were to be together without love," that sound would repeat endlessly. She paused, her voice unwavering. "I would literally be driven mad. And an insane woman cannot bear a child, nor raise one." Eleanor now regarded Pearl with an entirely new expression. It wasn't disdain or pity, but a sharp curiosity, like a predator encountering a creature it had never seen before. You are saying you are mad. No, Pearl corrected. I am merely different, just as your son is different now after his accident. The air in the room shifted. Alelinar was silent for a long time, her fingers tapping a slower, more thoughtful rhythm. At last she rose, took the weapon, and returned it to the drawer. 6 months, Alelinar said, her voice still cold, but now laced with something else. I will give you 6 months to solve this problem of yours. How you do so is your concern. Pearl nodded, then turned to go. As her hand closed over the doorknob, Alelinar spoke again. And Miss Whitmore, next time you are summoned, you will knock. Pearl did not look back. She opened the door and slipped out, closing it softly. Alone, Alelinar stared at the door, her lips barely moving. This one is not as simple as I believed. That night, Pearl's playing was ferocious. The music was a waterfall, a furious storm, the long, suppressed scream of her soul. She played the pieces she had never been allowed to touch, melodies her mother had deemed too passionate, too raw, too unsuited for the daughter she wished to keep locked away. In his room on the west side of the house, Jericho sat before the screen, transfixed. He knew instantly that something had happened to her. Her music tonight was not the quiet whisper of previous evenings. It was a raw cry of pain. Jericho didn't know the cause, but for the first time in 14 months, he felt a flicker of curiosity about someone else's life. A change had begun inside him, so subtle that even he did not yet perceive it. On the 10th night, Pearl was at the Steinway, just as she was every evening. A sliver of moonlight cut through the curtains, scattering across the ivory and ebony keys like stardust. She was playing a mournful piece, notes falling into the silence like drops of rain when the music room door swung open. Pearl stopped, turning her head. Jericho Crane was there, in his matte black wheelchair, a hand resting on the wheel, his gray eyes fixed on her. He had wheeled himself here, without announcement, without assistance. For the first time since their wedding, they were truly alone in the same room. Pearl said nothing, simply watching him, waiting. Jericho remained silent as well, his gaze sweeping over the dusty room before settling on her once more. The silence stretched until Pearl could hear the frantic rhythm of her own heart. Then he spoke, his voice a low rasp, as if unused for a very long time. What do you see when you hear my voice? The question did not startle her. Perhaps he had heard her conversation with his mother. Or perhaps he was merely curious. She had no reason to be untruthful. Muddy gray, she answered, her voice soft. Like a dense fog, like cigarette smoke fading into the cold night air. You're drowning in something I cannot name. A short, brittle laugh from Jericho cut through the quiet room. Drowning, he echoed, his voice tasting of stale whiskey. I perished 14 months ago, Miss Whitmore. This shell just hasn't ceased breathing. Pearl observed him, the muddy gray clinging to him like a fog that would not lift. She didn't offer the hollow reassurances people always did, that it would get better, that he would endure. She'd heard too many of those words to believe in their power. Instead, she voiced what she saw. There is a sliver of another color in your voice, buried deep, almost consumed by the gray. I can't quite make it out yet. Jericho was still, his gray eyes fixed on her with an expression Pearl couldn't decipher. What color? He asked, his voice now a low murmur. I don't know, Pearl admitted. It's too faint, but it's there. You're not as gone as you believe. No one had ever spoken to him that way. For 14 months he had been pitied, shunned, or treated like a broken thing in need of mending. But Pearl did none of that. She simply saw, spoke what she saw, and asked for nothing. Jericho watched her for a long moment before posing another question. "Why do you play only at night?" Pearl turned back to the piano, her fingers tracing the silent keys. "Because in the daylight it is forbidden. My mother said my music was the sound of a cat being strangled. She barred me from playing when I was 14. Jericho was silent, but his eyes darkened. He knew that specific wound, the theft of something you loved, being denied the very thing that made you feel real. Before the incident, his freedom was limitless. Now, crossing from his bedroom to this room, left him gasping. "Play," he said, his voice softer than before. "I will not forbid you." Pearl met his gaze for a second, then faced the piano. She began, and the music poured into the room once more. Brilliant gold flashed in her eyes. Jericho did not move. He sat in the darkness, a silent audience until dawn's first light breached the curtains. He said nothing. He was just there. And Pearl, for the first time in so long, did not feel alone as she played. 2 weeks later, assured by Nana of her privacy, Pearl called her father. Gerald Whitmore's face filled the screen. He was thinner than her last memory. His gray-blue eyes, so like hers, were heavy with dark circles. His shirt was creased, his silver hair unkempt. She knew he was in his small music shop, his only refuge from Constance. "Are you all right?" Gerald asked at once, his voice thick with worry. "Are they treating you well? Is anyone causing problems?" A faint smile touched Pearl's lips. "I'm fine, Father. No one is troubling me." In her vision, her own voice was a pale, washed-out blue. It was not the truth, but it wasn't a complete lie. She hadn't been all right for so long. The feeling had become a familiar state. Gerald stared at her, and an emotion she couldn't name flickered in his eyes. Then he spoke, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Pearl, there is something I must tell you. For the last 10 years, I've been secretly recording your piano playing." Pearl stiffened. "What?" "Every time you played in the dead of night, I recorded it," Gerald confessed, his voice trembling. "I sent those tapes to producers, to conservatories, to anyone who could offer you a different life. I wanted you to have an escape. Do you see? Despite your mother's decree, despite her silencing the piano, I wanted you to have a fighting chance." Tears streamed down Pearl's cheeks, unstoppable. For 27 years in that house, she had felt unseen, believing no one cherished what she loved or saw her potential. But her father had seen. For 10 long years, he had quietly collected every fragment of hope for her, never speaking a word. In Pearl's sight, Gerald's voice was pure turquoise, the color of unconditional devotion, of silent sacrifice, a hue she had so rarely been permitted to see. "Don't you let anyone extinguish your music, do you hear me?" Gerald said, his voice breaking. "Not me, not even that husband of yours. Don't let them take what is yours." Pearl nodded, the tears still flowing. "I hear you, Father." Gerald took a steadying breath. "I will find a way to come to you. I swear it. This time my silence is over." "Don't do anything to make Mother angry," Pearl pleaded, her worry for him eclipsing her own. "I have been quiet for 27 years, Gerald replied, his tone suddenly harder than she'd ever heard. "That is long enough." The call ended. Pearl sat in the quiet room, her cheeks still wet. She thought of her father, of a decade of hidden recordings, of a love that was never spoken but always acted upon. That night, Pearl played through her tears, The notes were a sad, beautiful melody, like winter rain on a rooftop, like the whisper of dreams buried long ago. In a room on the western side of the house, Jericho sat before a screen and watched her. He saw the tears on her face, the tremble in her shoulders, the way her fingers kept moving even as she wept. And for the first time in 14 months, Jericho Crane wanted to understand why someone else was hurting. A month had passed since he first entered the music room. He had returned on many nights, sitting in the gloom and listening without a word. Their conversations were sparse, but the silence between them had evolved from a strained void into something softer, closer, like two strangers sharing a shelter from the rain, slowly growing accustomed to each other's presence. Then Eleanor Crane declared that Jericho would appear at the casino's annual charity auction. It was the paramount event of the year for the Cranes, a night where Las Vegas society convened to showcase its wealth behind a polished mask of charity. For 14 months, Jericho had not been seen in public. Whispers circulated that he was dead, insane, or no longer fit to lead the Crane Empire. Eleanor intended to quash those rumors. "People are saying you're dead," she informed him that morning, her voice like ice. "You will prove them wrong." Jericho did not want to go. Pearl saw it in the way his knuckles whitened on his chair, the clenching of his jaw, the way the gray aura around him grew denser. But he did not defy Eleanor. He never did. Not from fear, but from a weariness that left no room for conflict. Nina Santos helped Pearl dress. The gown was a turquoise, off-the-shoulder design that hugged her torso before falling in a soft cascade. For the first time, Pearl wore something truly lovely, something that fit her body instead of pinching it or hanging like a shroud. Na styled her hair high, exposing the graceful line of her neck, and clipped small emeralds to her ears. "You look like a new woman," Na said with a warm smile. "No," Pearl told the reflection in the mirror. "I am still me. It's just that for once, someone allowed me to be beautiful." When Pearl descended into the grand hall, Jericho was there, waiting in his wheelchair. He was in a tailored black suit, his hair immaculate, but his gray eyes were as dark as a gathering storm. He watched her come down the staircase, his gaze lingering on the turquoise dress, on her bare shoulders, on the elegant curve of her neck. He said nothing, but the murky gray surrounding him seemed to recede slightly. Pearl stopped before him and met his eyes. "Your voice has a pale red tint tonight," she said quietly. "You're afraid." Jericho scowled, his jaw tightening. "I am not afraid." "Color does not lie," Pearl answered evenly. A heavy silence settled between them. Then Jericho exhaled, his shoulders slumping just a fraction. "I don't want them looking at me like I'm some broken thing," he said, his voice a low rasp. "I was the man they feared. Now I am the one they pity." Pearl paused, then replied, "Then don't look at them." Jericho raised his eyes to hers. "Look at me," Pearl said. "If you need a place to look that isn't them, then look at me." Jericho was quiet, but his gray eyes held her face longer than usual. He gave the slightest of nods and gestured for Knox to wheel him toward the car. The grand ballroom of Crane Casino was ablaze with light when they entered. Above, a colossal crystal chandelier cascaded from the vaulted ceiling. Hundreds of figures in shimmering evening wear flooded the grand hall. Champagne poured like a river as soft jazz haunted the air from a band tucked in the corner. Then Jericho Crane appeared in his stark black wheelchair, and for a heartbeat the entire ballroom held its breath. The whispers followed. Pearl felt them all, not with her ears, but in waves of color, Sickly gray curiosity, sharp green envy, streaks of black contempt hiding behind vapid smiles, and the pale, insulting red of false pity. Who is that with him? Surely not Jasmine, she felt one voice ask. I heard Jasmine abandoned him right after his accident. This must be the substitute. Those words were venomous, polished black. The cruelty unique to the privileged. Pearl gave no reaction. She had weathered such words her entire life, but she saw Jericho drinking faster than he should. The murky gray aura around him thickening, coiling like a storm front. He was fraying at the edges. With a practiced smile and hollow grace, Eleanor made the introductions. Pearl barely registered them. Her focus was locked on Jericho, on the tension in his grip around his glass, the hard set of his jaw each time a look of pity landed on him. And then she sensed a new color, a deep and threatening red. It was not the pale shade of fear or the bruised tone of hate. This was the dark red of dried blood, the color of mortal peril descending from somewhere high above. Pearl's gaze shot upward, scanning the second-floor balcony, the towering glass panes, the soaring ceiling, and its glittering chandelier, and there it was, a tiny crimson dot almost lost to the eye, drifting across the ballroom floor, a laser sight, and it was closing in on Jericho. It all happened in a flash. There was no time to process, no time for a warning cry. Instinct took over. Pearl lunged, her hand slamming against Jericho's wheelchair, sending it careening violently to the side. The sharp report of a firearm shattered the air, a brutal sound that tore through the music and laughter. The bullet ripped through the very space Jericho had occupied a fraction of a second earlier, striking the wall behind him with a dry, splintering crack. But Pearl was not clear. She felt a searing heat tear through her left shoulder, pain igniting through her body like a wildfire in dead timber. She crumpled to the floor as a dark crimson stain blossomed across her turquoise gown. Pandemonium erupted. Screams echoed. Tables were overturned. Champagne flutes shattered. The lights flickered, then blazed bright. Security swarmed in from all sides, Knox barking orders into his radio. Jericho watched Pearl collapse. He watched the vital red essence soak into her dress. He watched her face drain of color from the sudden loss of blood. "Pearl!" he cried, his voice a raw tear in the fabric of chaos. It was the first time he had ever said her name. Not Miss Whitmore, not her, but Pearl. He reached for her, but the chair had been pushed too far. As he struggled with the wheels, the medical team descended, surrounding her. Knox reported the sniper was found on the technical floor, having ended his own life before capture. No clue as to who sent him. Jericho heard none of it. His world had narrowed to Pearl, to her blood, to her eyelids fluttering closed. "Bring her to the estate," he commanded, his tone like ice, but a tremor shattered its final word. "My personal doctor. No hospital. Only he is to touch her." "Sir, she needs a hospital immediately," Knox insisted. "No one touches her," Jericho roared, and the entire ballroom went dead silent. For 14 months, no one had heard Jericho Crane raise his voice. No one had seen him display an emotion beyond a frozen void. But tonight, for the woman bleeding on the floor, he had roared. As medics lifted Pearl onto a stretcher, Jericho seized her hand. It was cold, unnervingly pale, but he refused to let go. He held it the entire way back to the estate, his gaze fixed on her unconscious face. For the first time in 14 months, Jericho Crane prayed. Pearl's eyes fluttered open to a stark white ceiling. The pain in her shoulder was a low, smoldering fire beneath her skin, dulled by the medicine flowing from the IV in her hand. She blinked, her vision clearing in the room's soft light. This was not her bedroom. It was the medical wing of the Crane estate, with its clinical bed, its beeping heart monitor, and the faint, clean scent of antiseptic. Then her eyes found him. Jericho sat in his wheelchair beside her bed. He was still in last night's black suit, now creased and marred with a few dried dark stains. Deep, dark circles bruised the skin beneath his gray eyes. A rough shadow of stubble darkened his jaw. His face wore the deep exhaustion of a man who had not slept. He never left, she realized with a quiet shock. From the instant she fell in the ballroom until this very moment, he had remained at her side, a silent, unmoving sentinel. Jericho saw she was awake, his gaze locked onto hers, and in their depths was something she had never witnessed before. Not coldness, not distance, but a tightly coiled knot of worry, fear, and a burning, restrained anger. "Why would you do that?" he asked, his voice huskier, deeper than usual. It took Pearl a second to grasp his meaning. Then the memory returned in a rush. The red laser, the shot, the searing agony. "I saw red," she answered, her voice faint. "I knew it was danger." Jericho stared, his jaw clenching. "You could have been killed." "I know." A profound silence fell between them, broken only by the steady, rhythmic pulse of the heart monitor. He looked at her as if she were an impossible equation, a mystery he could never hope to solve. "Why?" he asked again, his voice barely a whisper. "You owe me nothing. You were coerced into this marriage. You should despise me." Pearl considered this, her thoughts still clouded by the medication. Lying was not something she knew how to do. She had never learned. So she offered the truth. "I don't despise you," she said softly. "Your voice, it doesn't have the color of hatred." Jericho was silent, his gray eyes churning like a stormy sea as he gazed at her. And Pearl could sense a shift inside him. The oppressive gray was still there, but its edges were beginning to thin, making way for a color she had only glimpsed before. Then Jericho did something he hadn't done for anyone since his accident. He reached out and took her hand. His own was warm and strong, yet it held a slight tremor he couldn't conceal. He held her hand as if afraid she might vanish. "Thank you," he breathed, his voice unsteady. "Thank you for saving my life." And then Pearl saw it, clear as day for the first time. Turquoise, as brilliant as an ocean under a midday sun. It flowed from his voice from that raw, sincere gratitude. It was the color of truth, of genuine emotion, still so fragile and new. "Your voice just changed its color," Pearl whispered, a faint smile gracing her lips despite the ache that still burned in her shoulder. "I can see it." Jericho frowned. "What color?" "A beautiful one," she replied. "One I have never seen from you." He said nothing more, but he did not release her hand. They remained that way, in a shared silence, until the medication's gentle pull drew Pearl back into sleep. Days later, Pearl's wound was healing, and she could finally sit up. Jericho was in his study, just off the medical room, when his phone buzzed. Knox passed it to him, his annoyance palpable. Miss Jasmine Whitmore. Jericho stared at the name, his jaw tightening into a knot. 14 months. 14 months since she had bolted from the hospital the day the doctors said he might be permanently crippled. 14 months of a void so complete it was as if he'd never been part of her life. He accepted the call. "Jericho," Jasmine's voice purred. "A confection of honey and venom. I heard about the attack. I was frantic with worry. I need to see you. A cold, hollow laugh escaped Jericho's lips. 14 months of nothing, and now you're worried. Silence crackled on the line. Then Jasmine's voice returned, lower, dripping with the false remorse he knew all too well. I was wrong. I know that. But I can fix this. We can try again, Jericho. I never stopped loving you. I have a wife, Jericho stated, his voice devoid of all warmth. A sharp, mocking laugh echoed through the phone. Her? She's the replacement, Jericho, and everyone knows it. A pathetic thing my mother cast aside. Do you truly believe she is worthy of you? Jericho paused for a beat. Then he spoke. His voice was like frost. That replacement just took a bullet for me. It was meant for my head, and she put herself in its path. She nearly died for me. He let the words hang in the air. And what did you do when I was lying in a hospital bed, uncertain if I would ever take another step? Oh, that's right, you fled. Only silence answered him. Jericho ended the call, not waiting for a reply. In the medical room, Pearl had heard it all. The wall between the rooms was not thick, and Jericho's voice carried. She lay perfectly still, gazing at the ceiling, and felt an unfamiliar warmth bloom in her chest, a feeling for which she had no name. With mere words, he had made his choice. To the world, she might forever be the substitute. But in that instant, for Jericho Crane, she was something more. She was the one who had shielded him with her own body. And that single act changed everything. Minutes later, Jericho guided his chair into the infirmary with Knox a shadow behind him. His gaze met Pearl's, a question hanging unspoken between them. She offered silence in return. Some truths require no sound. Jericho's eyes never left Pearl as he spoke to Knox. Lock this place down, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Nobody steps foot on this estate unless I clear them. Knox gave a single, sharp nod. And wherever Miss Whitmore goes, Jericho added, his tone leaving no room for debate. I go. She will not leave my sight. Pearl met his gaze, and for the first time, a feeling of safety washed over her. Not as a treasured object, but as a person whose life was valued. Then in the 4th month of their union, on a quiet afternoon, the world tilted. Constance and Jasmine Whitmore materialized at the gates. Pearl was in the drawing room with Jericho when Nina announced their arrival, but before she could ask who, the doors swung open. 2 figures strode in as if they owned the very marble beneath their feet. Jasmine, poured into a searing red dress, her golden hair a cascade of perfect waves, led the charge, her heels clicking like a metronome of doom. Constance trailed her, clad in elegant cream and pearls, a manufactured smile plastered on her face, as if she had come for tea rather than to shatter a life. Pearl lurched to her feet, her pulse a frantic drum against her ribs. She shot a look at Knox, whose face was a thundercloud by the door. How did they get past security? Mrs. Eleanor countermanded the order, Knox replied, his voice strained. There was nothing I could do. The cold truth settled in Pearl's stomach. Eleanor Crane was still moving her chess pieces, determined to swap Pearl for the flawless daughter-in-law she'd always wanted. We came to see our dear daughter, Constance cooed, her voice like poisoned honey. Yet Pearl saw the darkness clinging to each syllable. We understand she's thriving here. We had to witness it ourselves. Jasmine ignored Pearl completely. Her eyes were only for Jericho, her expression blossoming into a brilliant smile, erasing 14 months of utter silence. Jericho, she purred, her voice spun from sugar. I heard you are recovering so well. I am just overjoyed. Pearl saw the color of that voice and felt a wave of nausea. It was an oily, iridescent black, a lie from its first note to its last, devoid of a single shred of sincerity. Jericho regarded Jasmine with eyes the color of winter frost. No words, no smile, no hint of pleasure or rage. He simply observed her, his silence reducing her to little more than an insect on a pane of glass. Constance moved to stand by her daughter, that practiced smile never wavering. Jericho, let's be direct, she said, her voice a parody of reason. This was always a business deal. Jasmine was the intended bride. Pearl was merely a placeholder. Now that Jasmine has returned, it's time to correct things. Pearl can be compensated and sent on her way. It's the best for everyone. The drawing room was swallowed by a heavy, waiting quiet. Pearl stood motionless, watching her own mother sell her out for the second time, like damaged goods being returned for a superior model. The sensation was horribly familiar. 27 years had ground it into her bones. But something was different now. I have a wife. Jericho's voice finally cut through the silence, cold as drawn steel. Jasmine's laugh was sharp and brittle. Her? She scoffed, her gaze sweeping over Pearl with pure disdain. She's the stand-in, Jericho. We all know it. The girl no one else would have. You can't possibly choose her over me. The words were daggers, sinking deep into Pearl's skin, yet she did not bow her head. She did not retreat. She did not flee, as she had done for the past 27 years of her life. Instead, with a quiet grace, she stepped forward, positioning herself as a shield between Jasmine and Jericho. Yes, she affirmed, her voice as still as a forest pool. I am the replacement. A flicker of triumph lit Jasmine's eyes, but Pearl was not done. But I am the replacement who took a bullet for him, she said, her gaze locked on Jasmine's. It was meant for his head. I put myself in its path. I nearly died for him. And where were you? An absolute silence fell, suffocating the room. The smirk on Jasmine's face dissolved. Oh, that's right, Pearl pressed on, her tone unchanged, yet every word a polished blade. You vanished. The second the doctor said he might be paralyzed, you were gone. 14 months without a word, a call, or a text, all because you dreaded the thought of pushing a wheelchair. You feared the pity in people's eyes. You feared being dragged down into his darkness. Jasmine's face went ashen. Her mouth opened, but no sound emerged. I wasn't afraid, Pearl declared, her voice ringing with clarity. I stayed, and you have nothing I want, because you already gave up everything that mattered. You forfeited your position 14 months ago when you walked away from that hospital and never once looked back. Constance started to protest, but Jericho's voice sliced through hers. Leave my home, he commanded, his tone like shattering ice. Both of you, now, and never return. Jericho, you can't. Knox, Jericho said, his gaze fixed forward. Escort them out. If they ever approach this estate or any Crane asset again, ensure they grasp the full consequences. Knox moved without hesitation, gesturing for the two women to leave. Constance and Jasmine were herded out like scavengers chased from a banquet. Jasmine threw one last hateful glare at Pearl, a look of pure venom. But it didn't touch her. She had fought for herself. And she had won. After the heavy door clicked shut, a tremor ran through Pearl's legs. The battle's adrenaline receded, leaving a strange, hollow ache in its place. She was turning toward her room when his voice anchored her. Pearl, She looked back. He was watching her, and his expression held something she'd never seen there before. Not just curiosity or thanks, but something far deeper, warmer. "Tonight," he said, "in the music room, there is something I must tell you." Later, Pearl sat before the Steinway, her hands still. She stared at the ivory and ebony keys, replaying the day's wreckage and triumph in her mind. The door opened behind her. Pearl turned to see Jericho wheel himself in, but he didn't stop in his usual corner, a distant observer. He propelled himself to the very heart of the room, stopping directly before her. "I have to tell you something," he repeated, his voice strained and raw. Pearl simply watched him and waited, and then he did the unthinkable. Gripping the wheels of his chair, he fought, pushing himself upward with a guttural strain. His legs shook violently, his knees buckled. A sheen of sweat broke out on his brow, but he was doing it. He was rising on his own 2 feet. Pearl shot up, her body moving to steady him before she could think. "Don't!" Jericho gritted out, the effort stealing his breath. "I need to be standing for this." He swayed, his legs trembling like saplings in a storm, but he remained upright. His gray eyes bored into hers, and in their depths was an emotion she had never, ever received from another living soul. "Pearl," he began, each word seeming to be pulled from the very core of his being. "I love you." Silence descended. "I'm not sure when it happened," he went on, his voice shaking but true. "Perhaps when you called my voice a muddy gray, or perhaps when you played for me in the dark, and I watched you on the cameras like a common thief. Maybe it was when you stepped in front of that gun for me. I love you, and I want you to stay. Not for a contract, not for my mother, not for any other reason than the fact that I want you." His strength finally failed him. As his legs gave way, Pearl surged forward, catching him as he fell. They sank to the floor in an embrace, Jericho's breath coming in ragged bursts against her. He tilted his head back, his brow damp with sweat, but his gray eyes were luminous. "What color is my voice now?" he gasped. Pearl looked into him, and she saw it with perfect clarity. The murky gray was gone. The fog had lifted. In its place was brilliant gold, shot through with shimmering turquoise, the ocean reflecting a perfect sun. "Gold," she whispered, a smile finally gracing her lips. "With turquoise." "What does it mean?" "It means you speak the truth," she said softly, "and that you are terrified of losing me." A laugh tore from Jericho's throat. A true, real laugh, the first since his accident. It sounded rusty, unused, but it was profoundly real. "I am terrified," he admitted. Pearl's hand came up to his face, her fingers tracing the faded scar along his jaw. "Don't be," she murmured. "I'm right here." And then she leaned in and kissed him, a soft, slow promise meant to last a lifetime. In that perfect moment, there was no sound of shattering glass, no echo of old pain, only the color of liquid honey filling her senses, as warm and gentle as the first light of a summer morning. To be truly loved was a feeling Pearl was experiencing for the very first time. In the 2 months since their lips first met in the music room, her world had been reborn. The desolate, cold bedroom in the estate's eastern wing was now a memory. She had found her place in Jericho's room, her nights filled with the rhythmic solace of his breathing in the quiet dark. There was hurry between them. Jericho grasped the strange fragility of her gift, that shattering sound she heard from any touch devoid of love. He waited, patient, allowing her to acclimate to his presence, to trust that his every touch was an act of genuine affection. And slowly, the sound of breaking glass faded into silence. In its place was a warm, honey gold light that enveloped her whenever he drew close. Madame Lorraine arrived at the estate, late in the 6th month, her face illuminated with a joy Pearl had never witnessed. "I bring wonderful news," she announced, her eyes glistening. "I've secured an audition for you in Manhattan before the judges at Carnegie Hall." Pearl shot to her feet, her heart hammering against her ribs. Carnegie Hall, the hallowed sanctuary every pianist aspired to grace, where legends were forged and greatness was born. "Succeed in this audition," Madame Lorraine added, her tone now grave, "and you will play in Carnegie Hall's spring concert. An audience of thousands awaits. It's a chance most artists only dream of." Pearl turned to Jericho, seated beside her. His hand tightened around hers, and a smile touched his lips, bringing a warm, golden hue to his words. "I'm coming with you." The words stunned her. He had been a prisoner of Las Vegas since the accident. "Jericho," she began, "you don't need to." "I want to," he interrupted, his voice resolute. "I refuse to miss this moment for you." A week before the audition, they were in New York. Jericho now walked with a cane, his steps measured and marked by lingering pain. 6 months of grueling therapy, 6 months of sheer will had finally lifted him from his wheelchair. The wheelchair came with them, a silent sentinel for when the exhaustion became too much, but he moved mostly on his own 2 feet. Their temporary home was a lavish Manhattan penthouse with a view of Central Park. Pearl dedicated her days to the music, repeating her audition piece until the notes became an extension of her very breath. The evening before the performance, she played deep into the night until Jericho's gentle hand guided her from the piano. "You must rest," he urged. "Tomorrow is the day." Pearl agreed, but sleep would not come. She lay wrapped in his embrace, her eyes fixed on the dark ceiling, her mind tracing the long path that brought her to this precipice. 27 years locked away in shadows, 27 years of being branded worthless. And now she was on the verge of stepping onto the stage at Carnegie Hall. The following day, a mere hour before her audition, Pearl sat in the backstage dressing room. She was a vision in a black evening gown, her hair elegantly styled, her makeup a subtle whisper. Lena Santos had come to New York to assist and was briefly away fetching water. Jericho was beside her, his hand in hers, his silent presence a steady anchor. A soft knock preceded a server who entered with a cart bearing a teapot and cups. "Hot tea, ma'am, from the organizers," the woman murmured, her head bowed as if to conceal her face. "It's to help you relax." Pearl murmured her thanks, her hand moving toward the pot. She paid the server no mind. She failed to see the brown wig covering familiar blonde locks, failed to see the cold malice in the blue eyes beneath the cosmetics. It all unfolded in a heartbeat. The server feigned a stumble, and the scalding tea cascaded directly onto Pearl's right hand. A scream tore from her throat. Pain, white-hot and searing, shot through her, 1,000 fiery needles piercing her skin. The boiling liquid seared her hand, the very fingers that held her dreams, her entire future. The room descended into chaos. A voice cried out for a doctor. Jericho surged forward, his cane forgotten, nearly collapsing as he scrambled to her side. "Pearl!" His voice was ragged with panic. "Pearl!" But the server had vanished. Amid the pandemonium, she slipped away like a phantom, unnoticed by any human eye. The cameras, however, saw all, and when Knox reviewed the recording a few hours later, He knew her instantly. The woman behind the disguise was none other than Jasmine Whitmore. Constance and Jasmine had stalked them to New York. They knew everything. They had orchestrated this ruin from the start. When the theater's doctor inspected Pearl's hand, his expression darkened. "Second-degree burns," he pronounced, his tone grim. "The skin is blistering, already peeling in places." Her fingers were terribly inflamed. Pearl stared at her swaddled hand, tears tracing paths down her face, not from the physical agony, but from the horrifying certainty of what would be said next. "She cannot play today," the doctor informed Jericho, whose face was a mask of shock. "If she attempts it, the pressure could inflict permanent nerve damage. She might lose all fine motor control. For a pianist, it was a death sentence." Pearl shut her eyes, the tears flowing unchecked. 6 months of relentless work, an entire life of hope. The dream of Carnegie Hall had just been extinguished by a pot of tea. Jericho knelt by her side, his hand shaking as it found her uninjured one. He offered no words, only the silent promise of his presence, a shield against the world. But Pearl understood a devastating truth. He could love her endlessly, but he could not perform for her. He could not step into her dream. This was her fight, and it appeared she had already been defeated. 30 minutes before the audition was to begin, Pearl sat backstage, her gaze fixed on her bandaged hand. The white wrapping was stark against her skin, leaving the reddened, swollen tips of her fingers bare and slick with salve. A dull, throbbing fire burned under her skin, a constant reminder of the attack and all that was now at stake. Jericho was before her on his knees, his gray eyes brimming with concern. He had cast his cane aside, forcing his weak legs to bend so that he could meet her gaze directly. "You are not obligated to do this," his voice was soft yet grave. "Other opportunities will come. Your hand requires healing. Nobody would fault you for withdrawing." Pearl remained silent for a moment, her eyes on the bandage, that constrained fingers once as fluid as water, now inflamed and throbbing with pain. Her mind went back through the long years that led to this room. 27 years. "My entire life, my mother called me fat, ugly, worthless," she started, her voice a low, deliberate current. "My entire life, I surrendered to her words. She told me not to play, and I obeyed. She imprisoned me in the attic, and I remained. She commanded me to marry you, and I consented." Pearl raised her chin. Her gray-blue eyes were edged with red, but they blazed with a fire Jericho had never witnessed. "Today, for the first time in my life, I will not surrender because of her," she declared, every syllable an act of defiance. "She and Jasmine came all this way just to shatter my dream. If I surrender now, they have won. If I fail to take that stage, then my 27 years in the dark will have been for nothing." Jericho stared into her eyes and witnessed a metamorphosis. The frightened girl he'd met 6 months prior, the pawn in a forced marriage, was gone. In her place stood a woman seizing control of her own story. "Your hand," he whispered, his voice laced with worry. "It is still here," Pearl countered, her gaze falling to the gauze. "I still have 10 fingers. I will play through the pain. It may not be perfect, but I will play." He remained quiet, processing her words. Then, with a slow, pained effort, he rose to his feet, his resolve absolute. He took his cane, his gray eyes alight with fierce pride, and said, "Then you must play. I will be watching from the front row." 15 minutes after, Pearl walked onto the stage, A blinding spotlight descended upon her, rendering her sightless for a few moments. As her vision cleared, she saw them. In the center rows sat the panel, 5 judges, stoic and unreadable in their formal wear, and beyond them, scores of others, critics, journalists, and luminaries of the music world, all gathered to pass judgment. And there in the front row, just beneath the footlights, sat Jericho. The moment she appeared, he was on his feet, body braced against his cane in quiet testament of support. He stood through the strain, through the fire in his joints, a steadfast beacon ensuring she knew he was with her, that his faith in her was absolute. A wave of whispers swept the auditorium as eyes fell upon the dressing on Pearl's hand. She could feel their surprise like a dull gray, their curiosity a faint blush, and beneath it all the black threads of disbelief. A pianist with an injured hand. The idea was madness. But Pearl paid it no mind. She crossed to the grand piano that dominated the stage, settling onto the bench. Her gaze fell to the keys, ebony and ivory, a stark contrast like shadow and light, despair and hope, a mirror of the 27 years she had endured. She drew a single deep breath. Her hands found their place on the keys, and the music began. The opening notes were fragile, trembling things. A searing agony shot through her right hand, a pain so sharp it brought tears to her eyes. Each keystroke was a fresh torment. A note went astray, then a second. The tempo wavered, unsteady and slower than it should have been. Yet she played on. Her mind drifted to her father, to the 10 years he spent secretly capturing her music. She thought of Madame Lorraine, the first soul to ever hear the gift she possessed. She thought of Jericho, the man standing watch in the crowd who saw her value when she had none herself. And then the music found its current. It was not without its flaws. There were moments it stumbled. There were notes that rang false. There were pauses where the pain threatened to overwhelm her. This, however, was not a recital of technical prowess. It was the sound of a soul laid bare. Each note held the weight of 27 years spent in shadow. Every melody was the tale of a girl branded worthless, who somehow kept her dreams alive. Every chord was a cry from a heart that had been shattered, but stubbornly refused to be silenced. Pearl played the music she had written herself, a composition born from the colors of sound, from the onyx of deceit, and the turquoise of truth, the murky gray of hopelessness, and the warm gold of love. She poured every ounce of herself into the performance, the anguish and the bliss, the sorrow and the joy, her entire being. As the last note faded into the vastness of the hall, Pearl remained still, her hand shaking uncontrollably with a pain beyond her command. She couldn't bring herself to look up, terrified to see disappointment etched onto the faces of the judges. She was terrified that all she had given would still fall short. A profound silence descended, stretching for so long Pearl felt her own heart might cease to beat. Then a single set of hands came together, then 2, then 3, until the entire hall was on its feet. A thunderous ovation washed over her like a cleansing storm, the entire world affirming that she had triumphed. Pearl lifted her head, her vision swimming with tears. She saw the judges standing, their hands moving together in applause. An older woman with hair like spun silver was dabbing at her eyes. In the wings, Madame Lorraine wept without a sound, her shoulders quaking, and in the first row Jericho stood applauding, his gray eyes alight with an immense pride. The lead judge, a tall, slender man in a severe gray suit, ascended the stage. He came to a stop before Pearl, his expression sober, yet his eyes held a distinct warmth. "Miss Pearl," he began, his voice resonating through the now hushed room. "That was not the most flawless audition I've ever witnessed." Pearl felt her spirit plummet, steeling herself for the coming rejection. "But it was," he went on, a smile slowly gracing his features. "The most beautiful. I have occupied this chair for 30 years. I have listened to thousands of musicians. Yet I have never encountered one who played from their very soul as you have just now. Carnegie Hall would be privileged to host you." Pearl wept. The tears were a torrent she could not and would not stop, a flood of repressed years finally breaking free. Measured footsteps echoed on the stage. Pearl looked up to see Jericho approaching her. He had cast aside his cane, each step a slow, arduous effort, yet his purpose was unwavering. He reached her, sank to one knee, and gathered her into his arms. There, before the world, before the judges, he simply held her close, whispering, "You did it. I am so proud of you." Pearl clung to him, sobbing into his shoulder. In that instant, she was no longer the outcast child her mother had left behind. She was no longer a substitute. She was Pearl Crane, the musician destined for Carnegie Hall. And she was cherished. The flight from New York back to Las Vegas took 5 hours, though for Pearl it felt like a fleeting dream. She slept the entire way, her head on Jericho's shoulder, her bandaged hand resting in her lap. The pain remained, a low smolder beneath the medication, but it had lost its power over her. She had succeeded. Carnegie Hall was waiting. By the time their car reached the Crane estate, darkness had already settled over the grounds. Knox opened the door for them, his expression unusually grave as he announced that guests awaited them in the drawing room. Pearl entered the grand hall, weary but content, and stopped dead in her tracks. Her father, Gerald Whitmore, stood in the center of the room, his posture a ramrod straightness she had never witnessed. He seemed leaner than when she had last seen him on a video call, with dark circles beneath gray-blue eyes that mirrored her own. But a fundamental part of him had shifted. The meekness she had always known was gone, replaced by the quiet resolve of a man who had finally made the most critical choice of his life. "Father!" Pearl rushed to him, wrapping her arms around his frame, oblivious to her injury, oblivious to the pain. For the first time in 6 months, she held him, and the tears began anew, though she felt she had none left to cry. "You promised you would come," she breathed. Gerald embraced his daughter fiercely. "I always keep my promises, my girl. I'm just sorry it took me so long." Jericho observed the reunion from a distance, leaning on his cane in silence. As Pearl drew back from her father, Jericho stepped forward, offering a slight, respectful nod. "Mr. Whitmore, thank you for being here." Gerald's eyes met Jericho's, taking in the man's pained but upright stance. He saw the way Jericho gazed at Pearl, his eyes overflowing with adoration. "No," Gerald countered, his tone soft yet firm. "Thank you for protecting my daughter. I've been told about New York, the audition, and what Constance and Jasmine arranged." Knox re-entered the room, his voice slicing through the tender moment. "Sir, they have arrived from New York. They are waiting under guard in the East Hall." Jericho's face hardened into a mask of cold granite as he nodded. "Bring them here." Moments later, security ushered Constance and Jasmine into the drawing room. Their former arrogance had vanished. Jasmine's hair was a tangled mess, her designer dress creased from the long journey. Constance fought to maintain her rigid composure. but raw panic flickered in her eyes as she saw Gerald standing beside Pearl. "Gerald," she uttered, completely stunned. "How dare you?" Gerald offered no response. He remained by his daughter's side, his spine straight, his expression a perfect blank. Knox advanced, setting a laptop on a table and playing a video. Footage from the theater's backstage area filled the display, showing a uniformed Jasmine purposefully tripping and emptying a pot of scalding tea onto Pearl's hand. It was followed by screenshots of messages exchanged between Constance and Jasmine outlining every detail of their plan to ruin the audition. Constance, however, would not concede. "It was a mistake," she insisted, her voice shrill. "There is no proof. This is all a fabrication." "We have the footage," Jericho stated, his voice like ice. "We have multiple witnesses. We have your text messages. And we have a formal statement from theater security that Miss Jasmine gained access to the backstage area with a forged ID." Constance's face went white. She whirled on Pearl, her terror instantly souring into a venomous rage. "You!" she shrieked, her features contorting. "Just who do you think you are? You're just a fat, pathetic girl, the disgrace of this family. You may have fooled the others, but I see the truth. You are nothing. That is enough, Constance." Gerald moved to stand between his wife and his daughter. His voice was not loud, but it resonated through the room with the force of 27 years of finely broken silence. Constance froze, her eyes wide with disbelief. Never had Gerald dared to oppose her. In 27 years, he had always deferred, always submitted, always allowed her to rule. 27 years, Gerald began, each word a sharp incision. For 27 years, I watched you treat my own daughter like filth. I said nothing because I was a coward. I feared you. I feared losing this house, my career, all of it. But that ends tonight. He stared directly into Constance's eyes, and for the very first time, she was the one who recoiled. Pearl is not fat. Pearl is not ugly. And Pearl is not useless, Gerald declared, his voice trembling with emotion but devoid of any weakness. Pearl is the most incredible daughter a father could ever wish for. She possesses a talent you were never bothered to notice. She has a heart you were never worthy of receiving love from. And I am deeply ashamed it took me so long to defend her. Pearl stood at her father's side, tears tracing paths down her face. But they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of absolution. A payment for 27 years of waiting, finally delivered in full. She approached and faced Constance, her voice as serene as a windless autumn pond. "I perceive the hues of truth, Mother," she uttered, "and your own has always been black. Black as an endless chasm, black as a night without a moon. I have listened to it for 27 years, believing it was the only shade this world held for me." She paused, her gaze locked on the woman who gave her life, only to curse it for 27 years. But I was mistaken. So many brilliant colors exist in this world. The turquoise of affection, the honey gold of honesty, the silver of hope. You simply shielded them from my sight, wanting me to exist only within your shadow. "I am not broken," Pearl declared, each word a quiet decree. "I never was. I am merely different, and different is not synonymous with wrong." Constance stood ashen and silent, defeated for the first time by the daughter she had always scorned. Jericho stepped into the space between them, his voice like the chill of winter. "Mrs. Whitmore, Miss Jasmine, you have 48 hours to vacate Las Vegas." His merciless gray eyes swept over them. I will leverage all my influence to ensure it. No one will offer you work. No one will engage in business with you. No one will acknowledge you. The two of you will fade into obscurity within the high society you once commanded. You attempted to shatter my wife. Now you will shatter yourselves. Security escorted a drained Constance and Jasmine from the room, every trace of their former pride gone. As the door clicked shut, Jericho faced Knox. Bring my mother here. Knox gave a nod and departed. 10 minutes later, Eleanor Crane entered the drawing room, her posture impeccable, her expression a blank canvas, as if she knew nothing of the recent turmoil. Yet Pearl perceived the shifting steel gray in her tone, a vibration of something concealed. Mother, Jericho began, his voice even colder than before, I know of the bomb, and I know of your silence. Eleanor remained poised, offering no denial. I believed Bradley would be a stronger leader. You were fragile after the accident. I did what I thought was necessary for the Crane family. You allowed them to try and kill me, Jericho countered, his words like small caliber rounds. I never gave the command, Eleanor retorted. But you were aware, he pressed, and you did nothing to stop it. A heavy silence fell upon the room. Pearl stood at Jericho's side, sensing the immense pain he restrained. Betrayal by his own mother, abandonment when he was at his most vulnerable, a wound far deeper than any projectile could inflict. You will depart from this estate, Jericho decreed, his voice unyielding as iron. You will live comfortably in the house on the city's edge, but you will be far from here. Your authority at Crane Holdings is hereby revoked. Bradley will be handled as a separate matter. He paused, meeting his mother's gaze directly. And should I have children, you will never know them. Eleanor's face went white. It was the most severe sentence he could deliver, more devastating than the loss of wealth or influence. To be severed from the family's future, denied the right to be a grandmother, forever barred from the lives of grandchildren she would never embrace. She stood frozen for a long moment, her face a mask of shock, then turned and departed without a sound. When she was gone, Jericho exhaled deeply, as if 1,000-pound weight had been lifted from his spirit. Pearl moved to him, taking his hand. Are you okay? She whispered. Jericho looked at her, and a smile touched his lips for the first time since the confrontations began. I am, he said. Now I am. Justice had been served, not through violence or weaponry, but through truth. It was the most gratifying victory imaginable. 2 months after that day of reckoning, Pearl stood in the wings of Carnegie Hall, her heart beating a frantic rhythm like war drums. 2 years had passed since she first entered the Crane estate, a mere substitute. Now she stood within the hallowed sanctuary of music, a place every pianist dreams of reaching. 3,000 people sat waiting for her performance. Lena Santos adjusted Pearl's flowing black gown, her own hands shaking with emotion. Are you prepared? She murmured. Pearl glanced at her right hand. The burn scar was still visible, a pale pink line against her skin, but she no longer concealed it. It was a testament to her fortitude, a mark of her survival against all odds. I am ready, she affirmed. The stage lights flared to life. Pearl emerged, a vision of dark elegance, hair swept high, moving with the grace of a queen entering her domain. A glossy black grand piano awaited her at center stage, bathed in a brilliant spotlight. 3,000 people became utterly silent. She could feel her own pulse, the thick anticipation in the air. yet she felt no fear. Her gaze fell upon the front row and she saw them. Her father, Gerald, was already weeping, though not a single note had been played. Knox and Lena sat side by side, their faces alight with pride. And then there was Jericho. He was standing, not in a wheelchair, not supported by a cane. He stood on his own 2 feet, entirely unaided for the first time. 2 years of grueling physical therapy, of relentless determination, and on this day, he stood tall for her. Pearl settled at the piano, her hands finding the keys. She took a deep breath and began to play. The melody she had composed, Colors of Truth, filled the vast hall. It was a piece about her journey, about 27 years in shadows, about the suffocating black lies her mother had planted in her soul. But it was also a song of the turquoise of true affection, the honey gold of sincerity, and the starlit silver of hope she'd discovered when all seemed lost. In Pearl's vision, the hall bloomed with color. Each note was a brushstroke of light dancing in the air, turquoise and honey gold and starlit silver intertwining into a living canvas. She played with her entire being, pouring in all she had endured, the pain and the joy, the tears and the smiles and the love, from those who were worthy of giving it. As the final note resonated and dissolved into the quiet, a profound silence enveloped the auditorium. 1 second, 2, then 3,000 people rose as one. The applause erupted like thunder, like a summer downpour, a global ovation celebrating her spirit. Pearl remained at the piano, tears tracing paths down her cheeks as she looked to the front row. She saw Jericho moving toward the stage. He walked slowly, measuring each step, but his gait was steady. Not on the verge of collapse. He was walking on his own, crossing the aisle, ascending the stairs, coming directly to her. "You walked without a cane," Pearl whispered as he stood before her, his breathing slightly labored, but his gray eyes luminous. "You walked without it today," Jericho replied. "I wanted to stand tall when I came to you." They embraced before 3,000 spectators under the glare of the stage lights, the world around them fading away. The applause continued, a roaring tide, but Pearl heard only the steady rhythm of his heart beside her ear. Later, in the quiet of backstage, as her emotions settled, Jericho took her hand. He asked in his familiar, warm tone, "What color is my voice to you now?" Pearl gazed at him, seeing the answer more clearly than ever. "Honey gold," she replied, a genuine smile spreading across her lips. "What does that signify?" he asked. "It means you're in love, truly." Jericho smiled, leaning in to kiss her forehead. "I have always loved you." "I know," Pearl answered softly. "I could always hear it." A few months later, their world had transformed. Gerald Jr., the first child of Pearl and Jericho, arrived on a bright spring morning. He had his father's gray eyes and his mother's soft brown hair. Whenever he cried, Pearl would simply play the piano, and he would instantly quiet, his wide gray eyes fixed on his mother as if he, too, could see the colors in the music. Gerald, the baby's grandfather, had moved in with them at their new Las Vegas penthouse. He founded the Whitmore Music Academy, a school for underprivileged children, tuition-free and fully funded by Jericho. Daily, he taught disadvantaged youths how to play, to discover joy and melody, and to feel worthy of love. Jericho had remade his life entirely. He severed ties with all illicit ventures, transforming Crane Holdings into a completely legitimate corporate empire. When Pearl questioned his reasons, he simply glanced at their son sleeping in his bassinet. He said he refused to raise Gerald Jr. in a world where his father could be a target. He wanted his son to have a father who would watch him grow old, not one resting in a casket before the boy learned to walk. As for Constance and Jasmine, they resided in a small apartment on the city's fringe, exiled from the high society circle they once dominated. No one would employ them. No one would conduct business with them. No one acknowledged them on the street. They survived on a stipend, watching every cent. And whenever Constance watched television, she would see Pearl's face, the daughter she had dismissed as a burdensome, useless thing, now performing for thousands, adored and celebrated worldwide. Eleanor Crane lived in a solitary villa far from Las Vegas. She was provided with every comfort and material want, yet a deep loneliness seeped into her bones. She had a grandson she was forbidden to see. She saw photographs of Gerald Jr. in magazines and society columns, but was never granted the chance to hold him. It was the cruelest possible sentence for a woman who had once been willing to sacrifice her own son. Model. One late night, with Gerald Jr. sound asleep and grandfather Gerald retired for the evening, Pearl was at the piano, a soft melody filling their music room. Jericho entered, walking unaided on one of his good days, and settled beside her on the bench. They sat in a comfortable silence, shoulders touching, letting the music speak for them. There was only the melody, the quiet, the love. In a world awash with deceit, Pearl had learned to hear the truth. She once believed her world was meant to be black, the shade of cruelty, of neglect, of an unwanted existence. She had been so wrong. This world held a spectrum of beautiful colors she was only just beginning to see. The honey gold of genuine love, the turquoise of truth, the silver glimmer of hope, and the most stunning truth Pearl ever knew was the sound of "I love you" from the man the world had cast off, the man who had stood from his wheelchair for her, who had taught her that being different was not being less. It was being extraordinary. The end.
Everybody thought Pearl was the extra, the backup, the girl nobody picked until the script forced her onto the stage. Her own family treated her like a failed version of her sister, then threw her into a marriage with Jericho Crane, the crippled mafia king everybody had already written off. And that is exactly where the chaos began, because the two people nobody believed in turned out to be the only real ones left in the room. Jericho had power, money, and fear on his name, but after the bombing, all of that became noise. The woman originally promised to him ran. The people around him stayed for duty, not love. Pearl arrived as a replacement bride, but unlike everyone else, she saw him as a person before she saw him as a fallen boss. That changed everything. While the world stared at the wheelchair, she noticed the grief. While people whispered about weakness, she heard a man drowning in silence. Then came the plot twist that slapped the whole story awake. Pearl, the one they called useless, became the first person willing to bleed for him. She did not save him because of status. She saved him because somewhere along the way, she became brave enough to protect what was still human in him. And Jericho, this feared kingpin, started healing not because doctors pushed him, but because one abandoned woman gave him a reason to stand again. That is the life lesson. People always worship strength when it is loud, flashy, and untouchable. But real strength shows up when nobody is clapping. It shows up in the girl who keeps playing after years of humiliation. It shows up in the broken man who learns to love without control. The ones dismissed as weak are often the ones carrying the strongest ending.